I was fired at 9:12 a.m., in the very boardroom where I had once helped build the strategy that took the company to its peak. No one in that room realized I was the only person who couldn't truly be removed. I didn't argue. I didn't resist. I simply nodded, as if it all made perfect sense. Because sometimes, the fastest way to understand people is to let them believe they've just won. The morning fog hung low over San Francisco, curling between glass towers like something that didn't quite belong. It softened the sharp edges of the city, turning even the most ruthless corporate buildings into silhouettes. I stood at the edge of the cemetery, hands in my coat pockets, watching as black cars lined up with quiet precision. Timing mattered here. It always had. Daniel Brooks would have appreciated that. The board members arrived together, almost rehearsed in their movements. Dark coats, measured expressions, voices lowered just enough to suggest respect without inviting emotion. I recognized every face. Men and women who had spent years discussing risk in percentages and people in headcount. Today, they spoke of legacy. I stood a step behind them. Not family. Not quite leadership anymore either, if the rumors circulating internally were any indication. Just the chief operating officer, useful when needed, invisible when not. The service began with the usual cadence, words like vision, discipline, enduring impact. I listened, but my mind drifted back 3 weeks earlier, to a hospital room that smelled faintly of antiseptic and old paper. Daniel had been propped up against stiff white pillows, his voice steady in a way that made the moment feel less like an ending and more like a decision. "No announcements," he had said, placing the envelope into my hand. "Not yet." I didn't open it until I got home. I didn't need to. I already knew Daniel well enough to understand that whatever was inside wasn't symbolic. 52%. Not shared, not diluted. Controlling. The kind of number that doesn't ask for permission. A soft voice beside me pulled me back to the present. "Ethan?" I turned to see Lily Chen standing a few feet away, her posture hesitant, as if she wasn't sure she should approach. She looked different outside the office, less composed, more human. There were faint circles under her eyes. "Hey," I said quietly. "You okay?" She nodded too quickly. "Yeah, I didn't expect this to feel so..." She trailed off, searching for the word. "Final?" I offered. She exhaled, almost relieved. "Yeah, and uncertain." I studied her for a moment. Lily had joined the company less than a year ago, sharp, observant, the kind of mind that didn't announce itself but always arrived at the right conclusions. Daniel had noticed that too. "You're worried about your position," I said, not as a question. She hesitated, then gave a small, honest nod. "My manager's already been acting different. Meetings canceled, feedback delayed. I don't know where I stand anymore." I glanced toward the line of board members. They were shifting slightly now, preparing for the next part of the ceremony. Efficient, even in grief. "That makes 2 of us," I said. She gave a faint, surprised smile, unsure if I was joking. I wasn't. The minister's voice rose, signaling the final moments of the service. People stepped forward one by one, placing flowers with quiet deliberation. When it was my turn, I paused longer than necessary. Not for the performance of grief, for the weight of what Daniel had set in motion. "Let them show you who they are," he had said. I placed the flower down and stepped back. As the crowd began to disperse, the board regrouped naturally, already leaning into quiet conversations that had nothing to do with loss and everything to do with control. I noticed how easily they formed a circle that didn't include me. Lily noticed it too. "What happens now?" she asked. I watched them for a moment before answering. "Now," I said calmly, "we pay attention." The office felt different on Monday morning. Not louder, not quieter, just recalibrated. People spoke in slightly lower tones, lingered a second longer in hallways, watched each other with a kind of cautious curiosity. Leadership transitions always did this, shifted gravity without warning. I walked through the glass doors at exactly 8:03 a.m., the same as always, but the rhythm beneath everything had changed. And I wasn't going to interrupt it. "Wait and watch." Daniel's voice had a way of staying with you, not as memory, but as instruction. I reached my office and paused before sitting down. The skyline stretched out in front of me, clean and indifferent. Somewhere below, the city was already moving on. Companies don't mourn, they adjust. A soft knock came at the door. "Come in." Lily stepped in, holding her laptop like a shield. She looked more composed than at the funeral, but there was tension in the way her shoulders held still, like she was bracing for impact. "Do you have a minute?" she asked. "For you? Always." She sat down, exhaled slowly, then got straight to it. "My manager, Ryan, he pulled me off the Atlas project this morning." I leaned back slightly. "No explanation?" "Just said priorities are shifting." She hesitated. "But he wouldn't look at me when he said it." That told me more than any formal memo could. Ryan Keller, mid-30s, sharp dresser, always in tailored navy suits that felt one size too intentional. He had the kind of confidence that came from proximity to power, not possession of it. Efficient, polite in meetings, but known for redirecting credit upward and pressure downward. People like Ryan didn't create instability. They adapted to it quickly, and often at someone else's expense. "How long were you on Atlas?" I asked. 3 months. I built most of the back-end integration. Her voice tightened slightly. "Now I'm not even in the meetings." I nodded once, slowly. "Then this isn't about performance." She looked at me, searching for certainty. "It's about positioning," I continued. "New leadership vacuum. People reshuffle visibility." "And I'm expendable?" she asked quietly. "No," I said. "You're early." She frowned slightly. "Which means you're easier to move without resistance," I clarified. "But it also means you have something they haven't noticed yet." "And what's that?" "Time to build something they can't ignore." She sat with that for a moment. I could see the shift, small but real. Fear didn't disappear, but it had somewhere to go now. "What should I do?" she asked. I leaned forward slightly. "Take everything you built on Atlas, refine it, document it better than anyone expects. Then be ready when someone asks the wrong question in the right meeting." She almost smiled. "That sounds risky." "It is," I said, "but so is waiting for permission." She nodded, this time more firmly. As she stood to leave, she paused. "You don't seem worried." I glanced back at the skyline. "I'm not in a hurry," I said. And that was the truth. Because the moment you reveal power too early, people stop showing you who they are. And right now, they were just getting started. It didn't happen all at once. That would have been obvious. Instead, it came in small, almost forgettable omissions, the kind you could dismiss if you weren't paying attention. An email thread I wasn't copied on, a calendar invite that never arrived, a meeting summary forwarded to me hours late, stripped down to conclusions without context. Individually, each one meant nothing. Together, they formed a pattern. By Wednesday, I had a clearer view of it than anyone intended me to. I sat in my office, scrolling through a forwarded document titled Interim Strategic Alignment. It was the kind of language people used when they didn't want to say power shift out loud. My name appeared twice, both times in past tense. That was new. A light knock broke my focus. "Come in." This time it wasn't Lily. It was Margaret Hayes. She stepped in with the quiet authority of someone who had never needed to raise her voice to be heard. Late 50s, silver hair cut sharply at the jawline, posture immaculate. Margaret had been on the board longer than most, former CFO of 2 Fortune 500 companies, known for her precision and her refusal to tolerate incompetence. She didn't waste words. She didn't waste time. "Ethan," she said, closing the door behind her, "you've been difficult to schedule." I almost smiled. "I've noticed the same." Her eyes lingered on me for a second longer than usual, as if measuring whether I was being naive or deliberate. "Things are moving quickly," she said. "The board is evaluating structural adjustments." "Without operations input?" I asked calmly. She didn't answer directly. "Transitions require efficiency." There it was, not exclusion, efficiency. "I assume I'll be brought in when necessary," I said. Margaret studied me again, this time more carefully. "You're taking this, well." "I've learned not to confuse movement with direction," I replied. For a moment, something almost like approval flickered in her expression. Then it was gone. Just make sure you're not left behind, she said, before turning and leaving as quietly as she entered. The door clicked shut. I leaned back slightly. So it was confirmed. Not an accident. A design. That evening I found Lily in one of the smaller conference rooms, surrounded by notes, diagrams, and half-erased whiteboard sketches. She looked up as I entered, a little startled. "Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt," I said. "No, it's okay," she replied quickly. "I was just trying to rebuild part of the Atlas system architecture." I stepped closer, scanning the board. She had reorganized the integration flow, cleaner, more efficient than before. "You simplified the API layer," I noted. She nodded. "The original design was overcomplicated. I think I can reduce latency by at least 15%. "That's not small," I said. She hesitated. "It doesn't matter if no one sees it." I picked up a marker and made a small adjustment to one of her diagrams. "Then don't wait to be seen," I said. "Position it where it becomes unavoidable." She watched as I connected two parts of the system she hadn't linked yet. "If they ask the wrong question in the next review meeting," I continued, "this becomes the answer they didn't know they needed." Her eyes sharpened slightly. The uncertainty was still there, but now it had direction. "You really think that'll work?" she asked. I set the marker down. "I think," I said, "you're closer than they realize." As I walked back to my office, my phone buzzed. A meeting update. Not an invitation, just a summary. They weren't hiding it anymore. They were just assuming I wouldn't matter. I glanced at the skyline again, the city now lit in quiet gold. That was fine. Because the more they underestimated silence, the louder it became. The news didn't break all at once. It unraveled. By the next morning, I was standing in my kitchen, still in my robe, when my phone began ringing before sunrise. The sky outside was a dull gray, the kind that pressed low over Chicago like a warning. The first call came from David Langford. David was in his early 60s, tall with a solid build that age hadn't quite softened. His deep voice carried the weight of someone used to being listened to. As the managing director of one of the firm's largest investment groups, he wasn't prone to overreaction, which made his tone now all the more unsettling. "Emily," he said without greeting, "tell me what happened." I leaned against the counter, wrapping my fingers around a mug of untouched coffee. "You've heard." "I've heard enough to be concerned," he replied, "and I'm not the only one." He went on to explain that several investors had already scheduled emergency meetings. Some were reconsidering their positions, others were waiting, but not patiently. "They trusted you," he said bluntly. "You were the constant." After the call ended, I stood there for a long moment, absorbing the shift. This wasn't just internal fallout anymore. It was spreading, fast, uncontrollable, a domino effect. By mid-morning, messages had piled up. Names I had worked with for years, people who rarely reacted emotionally, were suddenly uncertain, cautious, pulling back. Ryan had wanted speed. This was what speed looked like without trust. The front door opened quietly behind me. I turned to see Lily stepping inside, dragging a small suitcase. She looked smaller than I remembered, her shoulders slightly hunched, her long dark hair tied back carelessly. At 24, she was still finding her place in the world, though she hated admitting it. "I took a few days off," she said, avoiding my eyes. "I just needed to get out of there." I studied her for a moment, recognizing something familiar in the way she held herself. Failure. "Come here," I said gently. She set the suitcase aside and walked toward me, and for a second she was a child again. I wrapped my arms around her, feeling the tension she had been carrying. "I couldn't do it, Mom," she murmured. "I tried, but it's not working." I pulled back slightly, looking at her. "No," I said softly. "You didn't fail. You just hit resistance." She frowned. "That sounds like the same thing." "It's not." I guided her to sit at the kitchen table. "Failure is stopping. Resistance is where you decide who you're going to be." She looked unconvinced, but she listened. I thought about the calls, the investors, the company beginning to fracture without even realizing why. "Sometimes," I continued, "being pushed out or pushed down isn't the end. It's the moment before something changes." "For better?" she asked. I allowed myself a small, knowing smile. That depends on what you do next. The moment I left the building, I didn't look back. Not because I was angry, but because I already knew looking back would change nothing. The city outside felt unchanged, traffic moving, people rushing, coffee lines forming like nothing important had just happened. That's the illusion of corporate life. Everything feels massive inside the building and irrelevant outside it. By 11:14 a.m., my termination had already been logged into the internal governance system. That was their first mistake. By 11:37 a.m., the HR records synced with the compliance database. That was their second. And by 12:06 p.m., the system flagged a discrepancy. A red notification appeared on the screen of David Harlan, the company's external compliance auditor. Mid-40s, slightly overweight, thinning blonde hair, always wearing shirts a size too formal for his relaxed personality. David wasn't aggressive. He was meticulous. The kind of man who trusted numbers more than people, because numbers didn't lie unless they were forced to. He stared at the alert longer than usual. Majority shareholder termination without board vote confirmation. He frowned, then opened the cap table. At the same time, across the city, Lily sat alone in a small cafe 2 blocks from the office. Her hands trembled slightly around a paper cup she wasn't drinking from. The moment she had seen me escorted out, something had shifted inside her. It wasn't just shock, it was clarity. Across from her, Mark Jensen, a freelance UX consultant she occasionally collaborated with, noticed her silence. Mark was in his early 30s, tall, lean, always slightly disheveled like he had just stepped out of a long coding session. He had a habit of tapping his fingers when thinking, as if his thoughts needed rhythm. "You're not going to quit, are you?" he asked. Lily didn't answer immediately. "I thought I might," she admitted. Mark leaned back. "And now?" She looked down at her cup. "Now it feels like quitting would mean they were right." That was the first crack in her fear. Not anger. Recognition. Back at headquarters, Ryan Keller was in motion. He was pacing his office, tie loosened, phone pressed between shoulder and ear. "I told you this would escalate," he said sharply. His usual calm tone was gone. On the other end was Emily Carter, chief legal counsel. She was in her late 30s, tall and striking, with sharp cheekbones and a presence that made rooms quieter when she entered. Emily dressed minimally, black blazer, white blouse, no excess. People often mistook her calmness for detachment, but those who knew her understood it came from surviving a corporate scandal years earlier that had nearly destroyed her career. "I'm reviewing the termination chain now," Emily said evenly. "There's an issue." Ryan stopped pacing. "What kind of issue?" Then she said it. "He's listed as majority shareholder." Silence. Even Ryan stopped breathing for a second. "That's not possible," he said quickly. "It is," Emily replied. 52%. Fully executed transfer. Legally binding." Ryan's grip tightened on the phone. And for the first time since Daniel Brooks died, the structure he thought he understood stopped making sense. That evening, Lily walked back into the office, not to resign, but to retrieve her laptop. She stood in front of her desk for a long moment, staring at the empty space where certainty used to be. Then she opened it, started reviewing Atlas again. This time, not as someone trying to survive, but as someone preparing to respond. Because if Ethan Cole could walk out of a room like that without breaking, then something larger was still in motion. And she wanted to understand it. The first emergency meeting wasn't called by the board. It was called by compliance. That alone told me everything about how far control had already slipped from their hands. I wasn't there, of course. I didn't need to be. From my apartment overlooking the Embarcadero, I watched the city move like nothing had changed. But inside the corporate structure I had helped build, something had quietly cracked open. At 9:08 a.m., David Harlan, the external auditor, entered the secured data room with 2 legal envelopes and a silence that felt heavier than argument. He was still the same man, slightly disheveled tie, tired eyes, but now there was something sharper in his posture. Certainty had replaced confusion. Beside him stood Jonathan Pierce, a senior corporate attorney brought in from outside counsel. Jonathan was in his early 50s, tall, clean-shaven, with salt and pepper hair and a voice that never rose above conversational level, even when delivering bad news. People trusted him because he never tried to sound convincing. He just sounded final. On the other side of the table, Ryan Keller sat rigid. His navy suit looked tighter today, as if the fabric itself was reacting to stress. His usual composure had fractured into something restless, fingers tapping, jaw clenched. Emily Carter entered last. She didn't announce herself. She never did. Tall, sharp-featured, wearing a black blazer with no visible jewelry, she carried a thin folder under her arm like it weighed nothing. But her presence always made the room feel smaller. Years ago, she had survived a whistleblower scandal that nearly ended her career. Since then, she treated every case like it could become her last. That history had turned her into someone who didn't speculate. She verified. David slid a document onto the table. "It's confirmed," he said quietly. 52% equity transfer, fully executed, no conditional clauses. A pause followed. Jonathan turned a page, scanning once. "Then the termination filed yesterday," he said calmly, "is legally void." Ryan exhaled sharply. "That's impossible. The board approved the restructuring." Emily finally spoke. "No," she said, voice steady. "The board approved executive transition. They never authorized removal of a controlling shareholder." The difference landed heavily, not loud, just irreversible. At the same time, across town, Lily stood in front of a presentation screen. The room was small, internal product review, barely 10 people. But for her, it felt like a stage she had never been invited onto before. She adjusted her posture. On the table sat her laptop, open to the final version of the Atlas optimization model. Across from her was Daniel Reyes, VP of Product, mid-40s, broad-shouldered, with a neatly trimmed beard and a reputation for brutal honesty disguised as efficiency. He leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, expression unreadable. "Start," he said simply. Lily clicked. She spoke. At first her voice wavered, then it stabilized, then it sharpened. She walked them through latency improvements, structural simplification, system resilience under load. Every slide was cleaner than expected, every metric more efficient than anticipated. When she finished, the room stayed silent for a moment. Daniel Reyes leaned forward slightly. "You built this alone?" Lily hesitated. "No," she said. "I rebuilt it." A faint pause, then he nodded once. "That's approved for next phase." It wasn't praise, but it was recognition. And for Lily, that mattered more. Back in the legal room, Emily closed her folder. "This escalates beyond internal governance," she said. "We're dealing with shareholder authority violation." Ryan looked up at her. For the first time, he looked uncertain. "So what happens now?" he asked. Emily met his eyes. "Now," she said, "we correct it." And somewhere, far outside the glass walls of the building, I smiled for the first time since the funeral. Not because the situation was resolved, but because truth, once exposed, always moves forward. I came back on a Thursday morning. No announcement, no escort, no press release. Just a simple walk through the front doors of the same building that had, not long ago, watched me leave in silence. The lobby felt different this time, not because the space had changed, but because people had. Conversations dropped mid-sentence. Eyes followed me, then quickly looked away. Fear doesn't always announce itself loudly in corporate environments. Sometimes it shows up as politeness. At the reception desk stood Hannah Blake, a new office manager I hadn't seen before. She was in her late 20s, blonde hair tied neatly in a low bun, posture overly formal as if she had trained herself to take up less space. Her expression carried a mixture of curiosity and caution, the look of someone recently promoted into responsibility she hadn't yet earned the confidence to hold. "Mr. Cole," she began, then hesitated. "You're expected upstairs." I nodded once. "I know." The boardroom was already full when I arrived, but it wasn't the same board. 3 seats were empty, not physically, institutionally, gone. Margaret Hayes was still there, seated near the center. She looked more composed than before, but something had shifted in her posture. Less authority, more calculation. She didn't stand when I entered. That was her way of acknowledging that the hierarchy had already changed. Beside her sat Jonathan Pierce, the attorney, flipping through a final settlement document. And Emily Carter stood near the window, arms crossed, watching the city below with her usual controlled stillness. Today, however, there was something sharper in her expression, like someone who had finally stopped cleaning up other people's decisions. Ryan Keller was absent. No one said his name. They didn't need to. I sat down at the far end of the table. No one objected. That alone said more than any vote. "I'm not here to dismantle what exists," I began. A pause. "I'm here to correct how it operates." Jonathan glanced up. "And the board?" I looked around the room slowly. "Those who chose to violate governance will step down voluntarily. No public escalation. No legal pursuit, unless necessary." A silence followed. Margaret finally spoke. "And those who remain?" "They rebuild," I said simply. Emily tilted her head slightly. "On what terms?" I met her gaze. "Transparency, accountability, and one rule: no authority without visibility." That landed, not emotionally, structurally. By the end of the week, 2 resignations were submitted, quietly, cleanly, no resistance. Not because they agreed, because they understood continuation was no longer possible. Later that afternoon, I called Lily into a small conference room overlooking the bay. She entered cautiously, still carrying the same grounded tension from earlier weeks. But something about her had changed. Less uncertainty, more readiness. "I heard," she started. "That things are shifting?" I finished. She nodded. I slid a document across the table. She didn't touch it immediately. "What is this?" she asked. "Leadership assignment," I said. "You're taking ownership of the Atlas division." Her eyes widened slightly. "I'm not ready for that level." "You were ready the moment you rebuilt it under pressure," I interrupted gently. Silence. Then she exhaled, slowly. "I don't want to fail it," she admitted. I leaned back slightly. "Then don't think of it as something you can fail." She looked at me. "Think of it as something they can't afford to ignore." A faint smile formed, uncertain but real. "I can do that," she said. "I know," I replied. As she left, I remained in the room for a moment longer. The city outside was calm again, but stability after disruption is never the same as stability before it. Something had ended. Something else had begun. And for the first time since Daniel's funeral, the company was no longer reacting. It was learning. The building looked the same from the outside. Glass, steel, precision, San Francisco's usual language of ambition. But inside, the atmosphere had changed in ways no architectural redesign could achieve. There were fewer whispered conversations in corners, fewer closed-door decisions that no one could explain afterward. People still worked under pressure, but now the pressure had structure, not fear. I walked through the main floor at 8:10 a.m. as I always did. This time, no one looked away. They nodded, not out of fear, out of recognition. At the center of the open workspace stood Marcus Ellison, the newly appointed head of operations. He was in his early 40s, tall, broad-shouldered, with a calm, grounded presence that made chaos seem optional. Marcus wasn't the kind of leader who dominated rooms. He stabilized them. Before joining us, he had spent years in logistics systems where failure wasn't theoretical. It was measurable. That history made him careful with words and precise with decisions. He greeted me with a simple nod. "Morning." "Morning," I replied. No hierarchy needed to be spoken. It existed in clarity now, not assumption. In the strategy floor, I found Emily Carter reviewing governance documentation alone. She stood by a long glass table, sleeves rolled slightly higher than usual. Her expression was less guarded than before, still sharp, but no longer defensive. The internal restructuring had changed her role from legal containment to legal architecture. She wasn't cleaning up mistakes anymore. She was preventing them. "This version closes the ambiguity gap," she said without looking up. I glanced at the document. "Good." She finally looked at me. "You've reduced decision latency by removing unnecessary approval layers." "That was the idea," I said. A faint pause. "You realize most companies don't survive this level of restructuring," she added. "They survive chaos instead," I replied. "This is just controlled discomfort." For the first time, she almost smiled. Later that afternoon, I met Lily in a smaller meeting room overlooking the bay. She was no longer hesitant when she walked in. That alone was progress. Her desk outside was now marked with a small new title card. Lead Product Strategist, Atlas Division. She noticed me looking at it and gave a slight shrug. Still getting used to that. You earned it, I said. She sat down. On the table was a stack of revised performance reports. Clean, structured, confident. Not perfect, but intentional. I presented the updated Atlas framework today, she said. No one questioned the architecture anymore. They questioned scalability instead. That's improvement, I said. She nodded slowly. I think I finally understand what you meant before. About what? Making something unavoidable. I leaned back slightly. And? She looked out at the city for a moment. I think I'm starting to like it. Across the building there were still remnants of the old system. People who remembered how power used to move quietly, indirectly. But they were adjusting, because the environment no longer rewarded ambiguity. It rewarded clarity, not kindness, not cruelty, just truth, structured properly. As the sun set behind the skyline, I remained in my office for a while longer than usual. There was no victory speech, no final confrontation, no need. Because companies don't become better through moments, they become better through repetition. And for the first time since Daniel Brooks handed me that envelope in a hospital room, everything was finally operating the way he said it should. Quietly, precisely, and without illusion. Now I want to ask you this. If you were me, would you take control early to stop chaos, or wait in silence to see who people really are? And do you think a great leader should prevent failure, or let people reveal themselves through it? Comment your answer below. And if you enjoyed the story, don't forget to subscribe for more.